Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second episode of HRPOC's Expert Series. Last month, rather, was such a success with our first episode from Kim Jones, and she taught us the importance of metrics. Well, it was such a big hit that tonight we're going to have a part two, but this time is going to be how to wow the crowd, tell the whole story, and reverse negative trends. So we're going to go to the next part of working with metrics. This series has become so important to us that we've decided we're going to do 6 episodes, then take a break during the summer, and then start back in the fall. So we're very excited about the rest of our experts who are going to present to us each month. Don't forget about our HRPOC apparel. Make sure you go and purchase some of that apparel. And then don't forget to like us and join us on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. So without further ado, let's talk about tonight's episode. Tonight's episode is going to be presented by Janisse Dean, also known as Jay. She has been working as one of 3 regional human resources business partner leaders for Bye Bye Baby, a big box retailer dedicated to pregnant moms and new parents, whose parent company is Bed Bath & Beyond. Jay supports 30 Bye Bye Baby locations across 12 states, acting as the people partner for close to 100 leaders, to include both regional vice presidents. In her role, she consistently works on or spearheads large projects that affect the Bed Bath & Beyond enterprise as a whole. Previous to Baby, Jay was the director of human resources at Busch Stadium, home of the St. Louis Cardinals, and at Soldier Field, home of the Chicago Bears. She holds a degree in mathematics and physics from the University of Illinois at Chicago. I told you she was an expert. An education that has given her the ability to take large problems, make them smaller, more understandable, data points to tell a story, identify negative trends, and think outside of the box to create a strategy to reverse those challenges. She received her PHR in 2010 and her SHRM CP in 2016. Jay is happily married with 2 beautiful Black sons. Without further ado, Metrics Part 2, how to wow the crowd, tell the whole story, and reverse negative trends. Let's give it up for Jay Dean.
Thank you, Broderick. Thank you. I appreciate that. And welcome everyone to the HRPOC Expert Series, Metrics Part 2, how to wow the crowd, tell the whole story, and reverse negative trends. As Broderick mentioned, my name is Janisse Dean. I do go by Jay, and I am the Regional Human Resources Business Partner / Leader for Bye Bye Baby. And as he mentioned, our parent company is Bed Bath & Beyond, who I'm sure you're more familiar with. And prior to that, I was in the world of sports. So what I realized is that whether I was in the world of sports or the world of retail, I was coming against some of the same or similar challenges. These are both industries that have larger part-time populations that tend to be transient and a little bit unreliable. And so what I realized is that I need to begin to pull together data so that I can begin to tell that staffing story because it felt a little hit or miss, right? So before I kind of dig into it, I wanted to make sure that we said a few thank yous. So first, thank you so much to Broderick. Broderick Daniels is one of our HRPOC board members. And from the beginning of this process until now, Broderick, you have been so kind and so welcoming and super supportive. So I wanted to say thank you very much. I also want to say thank you to Lindsay Robinson. She is the HRPOC brand manager. And can I just stop and say, I love me some Lindsay? She has been awesome. She is a woman of her word. She's timely. She communicates well. She put that flyer together, and I loved that. And her tech support has really been second to none. So thank you so much, Lindsay, for all of your support to get us to this day. I also wanted to say thank you to Kim Jones. She is the CEO of Kelton Legend, and she was the very first HRPOC Expert Series presenter. And as we know, she talked about metrics, and she did the metrics part one. She set the table so nicely. I think we're all ready to eat now. And she talked about talent acquisition and really how do we push that process forward from an HR standpoint. And today, what I will attempt to kind of talk us through is how do we drive the business from a people perspective, really understanding that whole staffing story. Lastly, I wanted to say thank you to all of the professionals who are joining tonight. Those of you who are tuning in a little bit later, I just wanted to say thank you for being dedicated to your craft, your willingness to learn. And I think if you just get one thing out of this evening, well, then it was worth your hour with us this night. All right, so we're going to jump right into the presentation. I have a Prezi here. Let me share my screen. Give me just a second. Okay, we're almost there, guys. All right. So I do have a disclaimer that I wanted to bring out. You will actually leave this meeting with a bit more questions than when you arrived. And I know you might say, Jay, how is that possible? Why would I leave the meeting with more questions? Well, really, the expectation is that you're going to move from, well, how do I pull these metrics together to what, right? You're going to ask a series of what. What do our operators/leaders need to know? That's really kind of what's really important here is to be able to prepare them with a document that they can use in order to make decisions, whether you're in the room or not. What reports do I already have access to? So I want you to begin thinking about what reports you already have in your toolkit that are at your fingertips. What platforms should I become more familiar with? So we all have various platforms at our place of employment. And if you know that there are HR platforms that you probably are not super familiar with, but you should probably become familiar with, let's jot a note down and take that away. And so lastly, once we understand what our operators need, what reports we already have access to, and what platforms we should begin to become the subject matter experts in, we can then use all of that to pull together one report to tell the whole story. And then you'll finally be able to ask the question, what do you think about my fact-based HR story? And that, my friends, is how you will wow the crowd. So now let's talk about who this is for. So this presentation, practically speaking, is for those of us who work for larger employers, those of us who support multiple locations, and you're attempting to tell this staffing story. But again, it's just so big, it's difficult to kind of condense it all. This is also for those of us who support populations that have significant part-time or full-time populations with high turnover. And this is also for any size HR department. Our fearless leader, Crystal Brayboy, she consistently teases me about how small our HR department is and Bye Bye Baby. So it's me and literally 3 other folks who kind of stand up that HR department. So if I can do it and I do it for the entire enterprise, you absolutely can do it because you might be able to delegate some of that. And this is also for people who want to make decisions based in fact and not feelings. So plenty of times, we've got those narratives in our places of employment where people are saying, making decisions or, making comments about people, but it's just based in fact. It's based in their feeling about it, not necessarily in fact. So we want to make sure that we're always talking about making decisions in fact. Also, from an ethics standpoint, a work ethics standpoint, this is for those of us who do not mind working hard and very long for the answers. You will not be able to clock out at 5 o'clock when you're trying to do this metrics work, right? When you're trying to tell the whole story, especially if you're attempting to wow the crowd and reverse those negative trends, it will take you a little bit of time to get to those answers. The work isn't easy and you have to be thinking big. We've got to think about all of the components that are necessary in order for us to understand what that whole story is. You also want to be thinking outside of the box, right? So you're thinking big, you're thinking outside of the box. So you want to be thinking about, what reports do I have access to? If I don't have access to those reports, can I get access to those reports? So ask those questions. Hey, I don't have access to this report. Can I be part of the distribution? Can I make sure that I have the access in the system, etc.? And if there are also reports that you do have access to, well, you want to make sure that it has complete data. And if it doesn't, ask the question, see if they can, give you whatever additional information that you need. So an example would be, as I was pulling together reporting and some metrics and such, I ran a report. It was a termination report. And what I realized is that it did not give me part-time and full-time information. So I'm attempting to tell this whole story around termination, around why folks are separating, but I wasn't able to understand the designation, whether the associate was part-time or full-time. So I went to our HCM team and I said, hey, this is missing a whole column worth of information. They were literally able to stick that column in there within 5 minutes. So don't be afraid to ask the questions so that you can have the necessary information, again, in order to tell the whole story. You also want to be unafraid to speak up. So if there are parts of the business that you do not understand, let's get in there with the operators, with the leaders, and ask those questions about that part of the business. It could potentially have an effect on the associates, and there's probably a report that you can pull so that you can stick into your whole story. And once you've now pulled that whole story together, just another piece of advice, make sure that you're asking for feedback. And I know it's tough, and I know it makes you uncomfortable because you just put in all this time, all of this effort. And when I began to pull the metrics together that I'm showing you tonight, it literally would take me upwards of 20 to 25 hours to pull this report together. I'm down now to about 5 hours of pulling the report together. But, I still had to go back to the operators and the leaders. And I said, hey, tell me about this report. Is this what you need? Is this all of the information that you need? Am I missing something? Is it too much information? And if you're missing information, let's go ahead and get that added. And if it's too much, ask them very specifically, well, what is it that you don't need to know? Because if I can slim this report down, I definitely want to do it. All right. So now that I've given you kind of that brief introduction of what some of those stepping stones are that's needed in order to pull the report together, let's talk through the process, right? So for me, it's a 3-step process. I want to first identify what is the problem. So what are those consistent people themes that you're hearing in your place of employment about your people that you either want to prove or disprove? And so for us and Bye Bye Baby, I can't tell you, short-staffed was the reason for everything. We're short-staffed, and this is why we can't get the project done. We're short-staffed. This is why I can't train people. I'm short-staffed, so I can't hire more staff, right? And so I'm like, you know what? This can't be accurate for 100% of our stores. So let's start to pull some information together. So again, it can be based in fact and not feelings. So that's the first thing. Let's identify what that problem is that you either want to prove or disprove. The next thing you want to do is to pull out those need to know components and then identify the reports that you can use in order to, again, prove or disprove what that problem is. And so we'll kind of dig into what that means in just a minute. And then once you have all of that, we want to then create one report. So for us, as I mentioned, the theme was we are short-staffed. The components that were necessary in order for me to pull together to tell this entire story were what we have listed here. The first thing is the budget, right? So if you're telling me you're short-staffed, well, then you must not be fulfilling all of the hours you have available to you in your store, right? So let's take a look at that budget and let's see if you're actually staffed or short-staffed. The next thing we want to take a look at is leave of absence. For us, it's important, right? As we mentioned earlier, I work for a big box retailer that caters to new moms and brand new babies. So we get tons of folks that are attracted to working for Bye Bye Baby who themselves are pregnant. So we have a higher leave of absence population than I think most other places. So we wanted to take a look at what does that percentage look like in our particular stores. I also wanted to take a look at employment gaps. Are there places where we have gaps in employment from a leadership standpoint? So we want to take a look at that. We also want to understand overtime. What's happening from an overtime perspective? If you're using a lot of overtime, you might actually be short-staffed, or you might not. It really just depends on the entire story. But again, a need to know component in order to prove or disprove that theme that is going around the organization. The next report I pull is the part-time scheduled over the threshold. So you might not have a similar report to this, but we have one that I pull out of our workforce management system. And essentially what this does is this helps us to understand how many part-timers are intentionally being scheduled over that 25-hour mark. So for us, part-timers can only work 25 hours. And what we have seen is that there are stores that will intentionally schedule our part-timers more than the 25 hours. So if we see that that is a consistent theme that's happening week over week, well, they indeed might actually be short-staffed because they can't kind of fill those gaps unless we've got the part-timers working more hours. We also wanted to pull a recruitment and selection report. So what's happening from a recruitment standpoint? And this really kind of gets us to that talent acquisition report that Kim was talking about in the previous presentation. So you're telling me you're short-staffed. We've pulled all these other components together to show that you probably are indeed short-staffed. But what are you doing about it, right? So this is part of that whole story. Do we have requisitions posted? Do we have proper applicant flow? Are we actually pushing those applicants through the interview process and then hiring those folks so we are no longer short-staffed? What exactly is happening? And then lastly, we want to take a look at turnover. So if we are losing people just as quickly as we're hiring people, that might be an actual issue that we've now got to dig into. So you're telling me you're short-staffed, but you actually might have a different problem altogether. So now we're actually going to turn to the report itself. I want to show you guys what the report actually looks like. Okay. So this is the report. It is a very large report. As you can see across the top, we actually have some expanders. So I can pull this out. I can then bring it in and condense it. So I'll bring it out just for a second here. The first few columns of data, this is all just identifying information, right? So the location of the stores, the region that it's attached to, whoever that regional vice president is that's responsible for it, all of that is here in those first few columns. The next few columns takes us through historical budget information, right? So we talked about if you're telling me you're short-staffed, well, what's going on with your budget? So what we have here are our planned hours, again, the budget, and then how many actual hours were used for that particular location. And so this is going to be helpful for us to see if you are using all of your hours given your staff or if you're not. If you're not using those hours, that could be an indicator that you are indeed short-staffed. So again, this is historical data in these first few columns. Then I move over, and these green columns are kind of where we're at for the particular period. And it looks at all the same information. So planned hours versus actual hours, and then we're looking at the variance. And within this period, we call it a period. Essentially, it's the month. There were 5 weeks in this month. So I have all of that listed here. And then we move over into the month-to-date information. And the reason that we want to have historical information as well as what's going on in the current period and then roll it up to the month-to-date is because now we're establishing a trend. So what we're seeing now is that if over time you have consistently not used your hours, you probably are short-staffed. But on the flip side of that, what we've seen is that people will say, I'm short-staffed, but then we'll see over time, they've actually been using all of their budget. So is short staffing really your issue? It probably isn't, right? So again, helping us to kind of tell that whole story when you have that historical data that will allow you to trend the information. This next column here is our staffing variance. And this is really just very theoretical for the stores to understand. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying, hey, I'm looking at your month-to-date budget. And essentially, if you had this many part-timers, then you would have reached your budget for your payroll hours. So this is, again, just theoretical information for the stores to understand. As I had mentioned earlier, Bye Bye Baby tends to attract pregnant moms who are our associates, which is great because then we've got pregnant moms selling products to other pregnant moms, which is amazing. Very good for our brand and voice. But for us, it's important to understand how many associates are then out on a leave of absence. So we do have that leave of absence information here, active versus leave. And I also make sure that it's in a percentage. And essentially for baby, if we have more than 5% of our staff out on a leave of absence, well, now us as the HR professionals really kind of need to partner up with that store and figure out what do we need to do, because you are short staffed, but yet you got folks out on leave. And so how can we then be kind of creative and strategic in order to ensure that your store is able to run and operate as it should? The next couple of columns takes us through our active ratio. And so again, we have a very high level expectation of what this part-time to full-time ratio should look like. If we've got a store that has a full-time ratio that's higher than what we expect it to be, well, then this might be an indicator as to why they are short-staffed. So if we've got a ton of full-timers taking all of those payroll hours, well, we don't have enough hours for the part-timers. So then again, that's us then engaging in a conversation with the store leaders and with their bosses about, you know what, I'm not certain if we're really running the business appropriately and effectively here because we have too many full-timers in the business. And so we don't quite have enough staff in order to staff the store. The next columns of information takes us through some staffing detail. And what this is, as we talked about earlier, is our actual versus our optimal. So we have an optimal amount of leaders in every store that we should have, right? So we know how many assistant store managers we should have. We know how many full-time supervisors we should have. And then we have these folks called full-time specialists, and they're part of that leadership group. And so what we do is we compare that against the actual. And then, of course, we want to take a look at that variance. And if we have some deficits here from a management/leadership standpoint, well, this could be very problematic, and a store could indeed be short-staffed. Going to keep scrolling here. The next column of information, or columns of information, takes us through an overtime review. So we're looking at how much overtime a store is using for that particular week that I ran the report for. And then, of course, we break that into how much is that costing the store from a dollar standpoint, because, you know, people understand dollars and cents more than they do hours. And then we also look at the year-to-date number for that overtime. Again, what this is attempting to do is trend that data from an overtime standpoint. If we have a store that is using a lot of overtime this week, and they're also using a lot of overtime year-to-date, well, we might have a staffing issue in that building, or we could have a store that's just not scheduling people appropriately, and that's why the whole story is necessary. But still a very good data point to take a look at. The next few columns of data is our part-timers that are scheduled over that 25-hour mark that we mentioned. So if we've got a store that is consistently, purposefully, and intentionally scheduling part-timers more than that 25-hour mark, we want to know about it. So if we've got one and they're doing it for a lot of part-timers, this could indeed be an indicator that the store is short-staffed, because essentially they're trying to use their hours with just a few folks. And so again, a great data point to take a look at. Now that we understand what's going on staffing-wise from the numbers, from the various reports that we were able to pull together, we then want to go into the candidate activity. And so this candidate activity is essentially what is happening, because now we know you're short-staffed, right? Okay, we've proved that you're short-staffed, but what are you doing about it? And as we mentioned before, do you have job requisitions posted? And if you do, how many? how many candidates are actually in those job requisitions. This is important to know because it helps us understand if we have appropriate applicant flow. We know that if we have less than a certain amount of folks in that requisition, well, we don't have good applicant flow, and us as the HR professionals might want to step in and try to go into some additional solutions and tools in order to try to improve the applicant flow for that requisition. We also take a look at how many candidates and applicants are sitting in that review stage. And we understand what review means, right? That just means that they've applied to the position. And what this tells us is that if we've got a lot of folks sitting in the review stage, the store manager is telling us that they've got this, they're short staffed and such. But you've got all these folks sitting in the review stage. Why are we not pushing them through the interview process? So this column allows us to really have that conversation about, okay, you're short-staffed, but again, what are you doing about it? The next couple of columns takes us through how many folks we're declining, how many folks are rejecting us, and then how many offers we are actually making. And of course, we want to put that into percentages. And again, we understand that if the decline rejection rate is higher than what we think it should be, that's a conversation for us to have with the stores. That could speak to us not offering a competitive wage in that store. That could speak to the store manager just being way too picky for that particular building. It could speak to quite a few things, potentially onboarding issues and such, if we have folks that are, rejecting us after we've made the offer. So important for us to understand what that percentage looks like. Same thing for the offer. Oh, excuse me, guys. My spreadsheet ran away from me. Okay, the same thing from an offer standpoint. If we have those offers and it's way too low, then that's a data point for us to understand, hey, look, I need to go have a conversation with this store leader, because why are they not making offers? Yet they have all of these folks that are applying to the jobs. We're pushing them through the interview process, but for whatever reason, our offer rates are very low. So why is that? Let's dig into that. The next few columns take us through need versus hire versus terms. And this is rolled up information over a 30-day look back. So what essentially we do is we go to the stores and say, how many folks do you feel like you need, right? And again, we want to see what they feel, and then we're going to compare that to the facts of what's actually happening. So the need is what the store leaders are telling us they need. And then the hire column, again, is another report that we're pulling to see how many new hires we've brought on over a 30-day look back. And if we've got a little amount of hires that are coming on over a 30-day look back, that's problematic. And those of you in the world of retail, you understand, that our turn is crazy, and you just have to keep hiring and keep hiring. So if we are in a place where we're not hiring anyone, especially when we see that there is 0 hires over a 30-day time period, that could be an indicator as to why we're short-staffed, that we don't have enough, we're not making enough hires. And again, tons of reasons why that could be, but again, a very important place for us to take a look at. Same thing, I run a termination report here, rolled up information just for us to see how many folks we're losing over that same 30-day look back. And so if we have a store that's losing folks as quickly as we're getting them on board, well, something is happening, right? Let's dig into those numbers. And especially if all of this is happening within a 30-day time frame, well, something's broken, right? Something's broken with interview and selection. Something's broken with onboarding. Something's broken with our training process. What's going on in that store that we can't keep folks on board for more than 30 days? The next few columns here take us through wage information. So we just have this here again as another data point so that we can understand if we are having challenges, if we are having struggles getting folks onboarded, hired, and such. Well, are we offering competitive wages? Are people leaving us because they want a better rate somewhere else? We don't know, but it's good for us to understand what the minimum wage is, what that in-hire rate is, and what our month-to-date average wage is. So that information is there again as a data point for us to be able to speak to as we're talking to the leaders. And then these next few columns here take us through turnover information for various designations. So this is for store managers and then assistant store managers, and it goes on and on down the line. Now, I won't bore you with that. But up top, as we mentioned, we've got these expanders. So really important for you to kind of throw that in there so that the report is not too big for people to look at. Another thing that I always make sure that I do is down at the bottom of the reports, we average out whatever it is the column that we're talking about, just so that we can speak from, on average within the organization, this is what that data point looks like. So then as we're talking to the stores, we can talk about, well, look, you're way above average or you're way under average, right? Great information points for us to make a good business case. Then we also want to make sure that we're totaling up the information. Whatever it is that, needs a full rolled up number, let's go ahead and make sure that we have a total down at the bottom. Also, just a quick note, I always make sure that these numbers down here are subtotal. So you'll see that here in my my equation, excuse me, that went out of my mind for a second there. But this is for our equation. We always want to make sure that it's subtotaled. And the reason is because as you're filtering data and going through the data, these numbers need to change as you're filtering data. We don't want these numbers to be stagnant. So that's what that subtotal functionality will allow you to do. Now, as I had mentioned for Bye Bye Baby, we have 2 regional vice presidents. Essentially, we put a line right down the United States. One regional vice president takes care of the East, one takes care of the West. So I make sure to chop the data up, East versus West, and you'll see the tabs down here on the bottom. And then I always want to make sure that I'm providing a summary as well. So this tab takes us through, again, rolled up information of the same exact, as you can see, we've got those expanders at the top. So we're going to go ahead and bring those expanders back. But overall company, and then East versus West. So we can have that very quick, high-level overview of what's going on in a super quick snapshot. This next tab, guys, is the most important tab of this entire document. So we've got all those data points under that first tab, right, that we went over. But this tab is what really helps us to drive home the point about telling the whole story. So now, as opposed to us having hundreds of stores that are telling us that they're short-staffed, we really can now zero in on the stores that are indeed short-staffed. So it's important for you guys to kind of identify what are the indicators inclusively that will get you to that number, right? So for us, Bye Bye Baby said, hey, look, if you are leaving more than 10% of your budgeted hours on the table, that's a problem. If you have more than 1 leader deficit in your store, that's a problem. And if you are hiring less than 3 people over a 30-day look back, well, that's an issue. Those 3 things together inclusively is what finally gets us to who is actually short-staffed. So what I do is I take that big report that we just went through, and then I filter it by these 3 indicators, and then that gives me this little list here of exactly who is indeed short-staffed. Super helpful for those of us in HR, as well as for the leaders that are running these stores, to say, oh, wow, okay, this gives me a different kind of clarity. I wasn't aware that this was kind of happening. This report I pulled together week over week. So we're able to then see if there are stores that are hitting this report every week. And if there are, then again, us as those HR professionals, it's time for us to jump in and figure out what's going on there and how we can better support. When you get really good with this report, then you want to begin to trend the data so that you have some really high level information that those regional vice presidents, those vice presidents, those ZVPs can take a look at, or even presidents of the organization. So again, remember we said our indicators, if you're short-staffed, is if we're leaving hours on the table, if we do not have new hires over a 30-day look back, and if we have a leadership deficit. So for the leaving the hours on the table, what I had done here is just kind of rolled up that information. How many stores are leaving more than 10% of their hours on the table? And this report just shows us how many that's happening to. And then it's then up to the operators to take a look at this information as it's been trending week over week to say, what's going on like in this week here for week ending 2/14. So that was period 12, week 4. Why were there so many stores that left so many hours on the table, right? So that's for them to figure out, but at least we're preparing that information for them to be able to make those decisions. The next thing that I wanted to roll up and again provide a very high overview for was no new hires. So if we had no new hires over a 30-day look back, how many stores were impacted by that? And again, as you can see, generally it's like 38, 39 stores where that is. But for the operators, let's take a look at this period 11, week 2 for week beginning 1/3. Why do we have 94 stores that did not have any new hires? Well, I can tell you that was right at the beginning of the year, and no one's really hiring over, the end of Christmas into that first week of the year. So we knew that that was probably going to be like that. But if it wasn't, it's something for those operators and leaders to kind of dig into and find out what's happening again from a very high level. The last thing that I've trended here is the leadership deficit. So how many stores do we have, again, rolled up that do not have leaders or are missing 1 or 2 leaders in their building? And as you can see here, this second line for period 12, week 4, week beginning 2/14, we had 86 stores that all of a sudden didn't have leaders. But I knew that we didn't terminate that many people because I actually run the termination report because it's part of this report. So what I was actually able to do was to go back to our HCM team and say, hey, I don't think that this report is pulling accurate information. And so not only is this super informative for us as HR professionals, it's very informative for the leaders to be able to make decisions about our people that's based in fact, but it also is an indicator for us to make sure that our reports are appropriate and they're reporting out good information. And what we realized is that no, actually the report was not reporting out good information on that week. There was an update to the system and they forgot to update this report. So I was able to very quickly send that note and they corrected it. And as you can see, this next week right above it, we got right back in line with where we were. The next thing I talk about are these critical store trends. And so as we just showed you that last tab around critical stores, this is just for me to take a look so I can understand which stores are consistently hitting this report week over week, right? And so that's what this information tells us. So again, that's when you get super good in Excel, but this is the actual report that I do pull together literally every single week for the entire Bye Bye Baby organization. So I am going to come back to my screen so that you guys can see me and I can see you and ask if you guys have any questions at this point. Okay, so we're going to ask some questions a little bit later. So I'll just jump right back into the presentation here from a platform standpoint. So remember we talked about we want to make sure that there are certain platforms that we are very familiar with. We really need to become the subject matter experts. Excel is one of those platforms that is just awesome. If you don't understand Excel, please do yourself a favor, jump into Excel, understand how to use it, understand how to pull those, all of those, I keep forgetting the word, all of those equations together in Excel. Whatever it is that you need to do in Excel, it can do it. I'm telling you, I've learned so much just from pulling these metrics together. Your HRIS system, you definitely want to make sure that you're competent and fluent within that HRIS system. I know most of us probably are as HR professionals, but some of us are at the leadership levels where we don't have to jump into the system often. And if you are, still please jump into that system, understand how to use it, understand what reports are available to you. Your payroll system, again, most of us are not running payroll and I get it. However, you should really still understand how to use that platform, what reports are available to you because it's super useful. Your applicant tracking system, whatever that is, if it's not connected to your HRIS system, I would encourage you to become familiar with that and what reports are available there. And once you begin to pull these reports together, folks will indeed be wowed. and they will want you to share this with other leaders within the organization. So you really should become familiar with PowerPoint if you don't know how to use that, or Prezi like we're using today, and that's prezi.com, so that you can have kind of these interactive PowerPoints or presentations. YouTube should be your best friend. So anytime that there's something in Excel that I don't know how to do, I always just go to YouTube, search it, and it's always there. So always jump in there, and then obviously any search engine for any type of research that you need to do to pull these reports together. All right, it is now indeed time for questions. Okay. But I have to stop sharing my screen. Give me just a second, guys. Okay. I heard that we have a question. What tools are you using to pull this data? A lot of people use a few systems that may or may not be integrated. Excellent question, Akila. And that's exactly why we just talked through the platforms, because I don't have systems that are integrated, and I do have to pull those reports from our HRAS system. And we have, we are using, what is the name of our HRIS system? I want to say PeopleSoft. And then we also have our payroll system, which we use Kronos for that. I also pull information directly from our central team. So if there are reports that I don't necessarily have access to, I ask them to just make me part of the distribution. So, you know, you can pull these reports from these various platforms. And if you don't have the access, let's make sure that we're asking for that access to be granted. Do you manually calculate all of this data each week? No. And that is why it's so important that you get very familiar with Excel. As I had mentioned, those equations that you can plug into Excel will save you so much time. So I have a ton of equations plugged into this. And essentially what I do is I pull the reports from one place, and then I just kind of plop them into this larger report. But if there is some data that needs to be calculated, again, I make sure that I put those equations right into the Excel document so that they're already there and I don't have to kind of recreate the document every week. I'm just plopping the new information in there. Great question, LaDonna. Corey, indicators are everything. Absolutely. Yes, they are. Using metrics to dispel myths and complaints is super helpful. Thank you, Katie Jones. Yes, this has been so helpful for me, as well as for our leaders. I can't tell you how now the narrative has changed to ensuring that the leaders are running their businesses appropriately from we're short-staffed and this is why we can't get things done. Because now we can literally just go to the spreadsheet and say, you're not short-staffed. Actually, you're using all of your budgeted hours. You're not using any overtime. You don't have any part-timers scheduled over the threshold. You don't have anybody on a leave of absence. You're not short-staffed. So what is going on in your building? And typically it's like an availability issue, or they're just not scheduling to the needs of the business, right? So it really is helpful to be something to kind of dispel those myths. Last question here from LaDonna. How do you simplify the reports to share with the leaders? Do you create a dashboard, import it from Excel? So the report that I just shared with you is literally the report that I send to the leaders. And that's why I make sure that I have additional tabs. So we've got that one tab that has all of the data, but then we chop it up east versus west. So it's a little bit more consumable. And then that next tab is that summary of information, very high level, so that we can see what's happening with the total organization, what's happening for the East, and then what's happening for the West. And if they want to dig in a little bit deeper, they can always go back to that first tab in order to kind of dig into what is going on in their particular locations. Okay. Katie Jones, has having access to this data and presenting it on a regular basis allowed you to elevate your presence with the leadership team? Ooh, that's such a great question. And yes is the answer. I can't tell you how many folks, like once I pulled it together and I shared it with my boss and my colleagues, they were like, this is amazing, Jay. And I'm like, oh, well, thank you. You know, how can we make sure that we're sharing it with the other leaders in the organization? And so I was able to pull together meetings. And so I'm part of both of the leadership teams, the leadership team on the East and the leadership team on the West, we have meetings every other day. And so during those days, I said, hey, I just want a few minutes so that I can present this report to the other leaders on the call, which is what I had done. And again, asked for that feedback. Hey, is this too much? Is this too little? What do you want me to add? And let me tell you, this report that you guys just saw was like the 4th or 5th iteration of this report, where there was certain data that I didn't need to have in there. And then there was some data that I was absolutely missing. And so it was helpful to be able to have that feedback and that exchange from my leadership colleagues in order to be able to tell that whole story. Once they saw that this was happening, I was able to then even go higher with the leadership and say, hey, look, this is what we're doing for baby. This is how we're making people-powered decisions based in fact and data. And now I've gotten to a place, because it's such a useful tool, that I finally began to work with the workforce management team, got the green light to do that. And now they're actually working on the back end of that to create this report, so I don't have to create it. So literally it's going to come at a push of a button. So what I've done now is really kind of created a brand new report that the organization will kind of continue to use even if I were no longer with Bye Bye Baby, and that makes me very happy. What tools do you use from Sunny? What tools do you use to pull all of this data? It's a lot. Huge spreadsheet. How is the data cleaned and cross-checked? That is such a good question. I'm glad you asked. So essentially I pull together all of these reports. And as I pull the reports, I plop the data in. But as you might have seen in the report, I consistently have those store numbers kind of strategically throughout the report so that I can always line the store numbers up, right? So I take a look at it on the back end, make sure that the numbers of the store numbers are accurate and that the lines of data are on the right lines, because you're right, you definitely don't want to push out junk. So on the back end, I'm looking at those reports that I pull. I then pull the store numbers. I make sure I cross-check that information, and then I plop it into the report. It is a huge spreadsheet, and initially it's very overwhelming, but the more that you work in it, the more you realize exactly where you probably need to go, that you don't necessarily need to review the entire spreadsheet. And it also allows us, as we got to that critical tab, it allows us to kind of go straight to those stores that need our help. So very important for not just those critical stores, but even those stores that are, again, saying that they're short-staffed, and they're not short-staffed. So we can always pull that and just kind of go across their line of data. It feels like a lot, but it's not as much once you get used to looking at the information. I'm assuming the rows are different stores. Yes, Sunny, they are. So it's for every store that that is within the organization. So it's not just the stores that I'm responsible for. I do it for the entire organization. And that's another thing that I had to ask for, which was access to the entire organization when I run reports. At first, I only had access to my region, right? But then because I was pulling this together, I told my boss what I wanted to do. And he was like, yeah, no problem. We'll get you the access. So all I had to do was send a couple of emails and I got the accesses. But yeah, those different rows are for different store numbers so that we can look and see what's happening at every location.
All right. Well, thank you, Jay. That was amazing. Great information. It's amazing that you were able to give us so much in such a small amount of time. So as you all see, we needed a part 2 for this metrics. Johnny Taylor, the CEO of SHRM, said one of the areas in order to move up to the top positions available in HR in America is people analytics. And analytics uses metrics to help you make decisions about how to move forward. So thank you, Jay, for this relevant, on-time message to help us with our A game for metrics. You did an amazing job tonight.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So this presentation will be available soon. As you all know, it was on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. The episode was recorded, and you'll be able to view that on demand very soon. Also, the slides that she had, she's going to send that to us later, and we'll have that available in our Facebook group. I want to say thank you to Lindsay Robinson for being our behind-the-scenes expert. and facilitating this series for us. Again, we are doing a 6-episode HRPOC expert series. And so this was episode 2. Next month, April the 13th, we will have episode 3. Jamila Thomas from my home state of Arkansas will be talking to us about identifying and eliminating socioeconomic bias in the workplace. Well, wow, that is going to be phenomenal. I also want to thank Crystal Brayboy, our fearless leader, our founder, for giving us this space to support one another in such a phenomenal way. So thank you all so much for being with us tonight. This has been amazing. Thank you and good night.